is she is ill today. She called out this morning, so she's very sorry to miss our last meeting, but she will not be here tonight. So I am going to attempt to halfway fill her shoes on the meeting, but she's very sorry to miss it. And I'm sorry that our last meeting is not an ice cream social somewhere outside or something. So you know, we'd like to do something a bit more celebratory than this, but and you may hear from us with an invitation to do something like that. But so I guess it's sort of fitting that if we're going to start in a pandemic, we'll just kind of finish off at the tail end of the pandemic and go from there. But thanks everybody for coming. We're talking about a few things today. We want to go over, I'm not going to share my screen quite yet. You've saw the agenda, but we're going to go over a couple of just some updates on the project, go over some key things that came up out of the open house. That's still on because it's sort of a running thing. It's just going to stay up. It doesn't have a time frame. We'll just update it with different dates or things as things move forward. We're going to talk about cottage clusters quite a bit today. And then we'll talk generally about, now that the draft code is out there, if there are some things, questions, if folks have had some time to take a look at the language, if there are some key things or things that you wanted to chat about that, we can talk about that, take in your questions about it, see if we can provide some answers or some clarity, or if nothing else, just take in your comments. And then we can, as we're kind of working through sort of refining the code from here on. We'll talk about the process kind of going forward. We'll wrap it up, talk about a little bit about next steps, and send everybody out into probably still sunshine at this point for tonight as well. But so that's where we are tonight. So yes, Councillor Beatty, sorry.
You can call me Lisa.
It feels weird.
I saw the planning commission canceled last night. Was that
we didn't have a quorum? Yeah, it was a quorum issue. Yeah. We're going to reschedule that that discussion, and I'll get to that. So thank you for asking that. Yeah, we were supposed to have that discussion, but we're going to hopefully we're looking to reschedule that at a different date in August, so we won't lose that workshop time. The sort of the project update, what I can share this, and then we'll sort of go over to the schedule and the presentation, but we submitted the draft code to DLCD to sort of close out the grant. We submitted everything on a Friday on the 18th, and by the following Wednesday, we were informed that it met all of the requirements for the grant, and they were issuing us a big check. So it was probably the fastest turnaround from the state to review things and issue the funds. So so that was great. They'll obviously look at things in much more detail when we actually post like the full code with all of the things, but they were really, really happy to see how far we'd come with that. So thanks very much to everybody for getting us to that point for sure. Again, that draft code was a milestone and a place to start as we move forward in the adoption process. But it was a big lift, and I really appreciate everybody's help in getting us there. Let me share my screen really quick here, and we are going to talk about, just sort of give us an update on sort of where we are right now. It's the summer of comprehensive plan implementation. It's like a concert series, but it's not. It's a series of work sessions. We were, again, last night, we were looking to start our series of work sessions with the Planning Commission. We're doing it in batches of topics to talk through. We will be rescheduling that meeting. I think it's going to be the first week of August. But we wanted to talk about the comprehensive plan text and map, the zoning map, permitted uses, parking, and the ADU standards. So that's sort of batch one. Batch two is
the batch one going to be at the August, or is it going to go to the end?
We're looking at, we were trying to find 1 or 2 dates that worked for the Planning Commission, but batch one's just going to get bumped to, I think it's August 5th. We are thinking about, it's going to be a special meeting. We're actually setting a special date. We're not grouping, we're not combining batches for a night because it's just too much to get into. We really wanted everybody to have enough time. So the Planning Commission was fine with us setting a separate date to reschedule for the batch one discussion. And as soon as we know, I'll get it out to everybody so that you know what date it's going to be. And that will be on Zoom. That will be a Zoom meeting. Rather than try to coordinate for the cable, the television folks and stuff, we're going to do it like we do these meetings. It'll be on Zoom. Everybody can participate. We'll record it and then we'll post it for folks to be able to watch later if they need to. August 10th, we're going to talk about design and development standards, and that's a big topic. So that's the topic for batch number 2. And then August 24th is batch number 3. The batches might flip. We're going to talk to Marcy's team about some of the graphics and the things that they're going to be helping us with. So we may end up, and we just have to coordinate internally if we're going to swap the batches and the dates kind of when we do stuff. But the next batch or a batch then are the flag lots and back lot standards, variances, natural resources stuff, and then Title 17 land division. So those are kind of how those are the chunks of topics that we're going to be talking about. We have put this graphic on both the Engage Milwaukee website and the project website on the city's webpage. So we are able to let folks know what's going to be discussed when. We're collecting written comments from folks about any of these things. So the idea is that we're in a refinement process with the code. Hoping to have, and these are all tentative kind of ideas. The idea was to have revised code in September, start the planning commission hearings in October. And that's just if things get delayed, they get delayed because we're talking about things even more, that's fine. But the idea was that we would then have hearings in October and then start the city council hearings in December. But we'll see where we go once we kind of really get into the meat of these, of the work sessions and the hearings. But that's the general idea.
And will the planning commission, I mean, I know the tree code is starting with the tree board. That makes perfect sense. But will it also go to the planning?
Okay. Yes. Yep. We're going to have the tree code will be coming in concurrently with the rest of the stuff. So yes. Yep. We'll be talking about all of it. Yep. That's the idea. And Natalie, can you share any details about sort of the kind of the rollout of the tree piece of things a little bit?
Yeah, we're going to be essentially, so for the tree code, there's going to be the private development portion of the tree code, as well as the private non-development and programmatic permit section. So essentially we're splitting the two apart because while they share similar concepts, they are independent of each other. And it's just going to be more digestible to split them. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be meeting with council for some work sessions on the private non-development tree code. So that's like for individual property owners who are just considering removing a single tree or a few trees, not in development circumstances or situations. So we're going to bring that for a work session. And then essentially once it gets to a point with council that it's, we're comfortable with it, and maybe we'll still maintain some community comment, we're essentially going to put a pause on it while the development tree code kind of moves forward with planning commission and council. And then we're going to essentially all bring it back to adopt it as a package at the very end with the rest of the code. And this just makes it easier for us to do both outreach related to the two, but then also, to essentially make it less confusing, because there might be some confusion around, okay, well, different mitigation standards and requirements for private non-development and private development. So separating them keeps it essentially more digestible.
Great, thank you. Okay. Shall we chat about? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I will say too, we're going to be working with a consultant to develop Enviro Issues. Essentially, we're working with Enviro Issues to develop outreach materials related to the tree code coming out, as well as our urban forest program. So hopefully we'll have those materials by the end of August or September is my goal. So that way we can essentially get ahead of community questions and concerns, and we'll actually have materials for staff to pass out to the community, as well as members of CPIC or a tree board.
Great. And on that note, we have a couple of dates already scheduled where we will be at the community booth at the farmers market with materials, talking about the housing project, housing things. We'll have handouts for the tree stuff as well. And so folks will know kind of what the adoption process is and the key ideas about what the code package even is. You know, what is middle housing and what are we trying to do, so that folks, hopefully we're getting the word out as much as we can, so folks know how to participate and what's happening and where we are in the process. And I'll be there to answer questions, of course, if folks have questions about that too. So we've got a couple of dates. The first one is July 25th, actually. So not this coming Sunday, but the next, I'll be there. And then we've got another one in September where we'll do that. So we'll sort of be tying, you know, at the end of hopefully at the end of the work sessions, getting ready for the hearings. And so we'll have another presence at the farmers market to let people know when the hearings are starting as well. Okay. Should we talk about the open house? Mary.
Yeah, I'm just going to be pretty quick on here because the open house really was just more informational campaigning versus trying to get survey data and things like that. So there's not a ton of like data information to go over, but we did leave the comment sections open on all of the stations. So each station had, it was split up between housing, parking, trees, schedule, hearing schedule, and all of that stuff. And so it was able to provide a summary kind of what the draft code was proposing, but also plenty of links for people who really wanted to get into the weeds and actually read the code updates. They could do that as well. But we did keep the comment section open and we made it pretty clear, like, hey, if you have questions, please put them down there. Staff will respond to anything. And we've actually, a majority of the comments have been questions, which has been really helpful for people to kind of better understand what they're reading. For example, we've had people be like, am I reading this correctly? This is what I'm thinking it says, and we can respond to them, you know, within less than a day and kind of get back to them, which has been really, really helpful. And Natalie's been really helpful answering all of the tree questions. So if you haven't gone to the Engage Milwaukee Comp Plan Open House project website, go to it. It's really interesting to see like what are the questions that are coming up for people and what are their concerns. We have about 38, actually, I think we have over 40 now because I've got a couple more comments that came in since I updated this. That does include our responses to them, but it's been helpful to kind of see what people are thinking. So yeah, and we'll, like Vera said at the beginning, we'll be continuing to update it, which is another reason why it's helpful to use this Engage site, because we can in real time really quickly update things. Like, for example, when the Planning Commission meeting ended up needing to get canceled, we could re-upload the graphic really quickly and make sure people knew what was going on. So I think this will be really helpful throughout the hearing process as well, for people to kind of understand when things are coming up, how they can comment and still kind of partake in this process, even though it's going to be in hearing sections and work sessions and all of that. Yeah, but questions? Yeah.
So when you say 38 comments, I mean, so dropping out some that are staff responses, you don't mean 38 individual commenters, because there are 2 or 3 people on there.
That's a good point. There are some people that have commented more than once. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a good point. It's not 38 individual people.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so my corollary question is, I'm pretty sure that Engage Milwaukee can do this. Do we know how many individual users have paged through the?
Oh, I actually logged in to the site because I was like, maybe there'll be questions. Let me see. I have it pulled up here, and sometimes it can tell me that sort of thing. Let's see. I just have to figure out which of the, maybe it's in this one. Yeah. Yeah, so it says we've got, let's see, like the housing one, the housing station 3 is obviously the most popular. It has had 92 visitors. I will caveat that is it could count somebody twice or more than once. If like, so what Bang the Table, the site that we use, told me is like, if it won't count them within a 30-minute time period, but say they like log off come back the next day, it'll count them as a new person. So it's not always accurate, but it's a good indicator to see like, oh, are people, which stations are the most popular? So yeah, consistently we've got 92, 74 on trees, 80 on parking, 91 on the zoning map station, 58 on next steps, and then 49 on the project background, the first station. So consistently actually good numbers. It doesn't drop significantly on either of the stations. So yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dan, you have your hand raised. Question?
Yeah, I was just trying to remember, it's been a while since I've registered for the Engage Milwaukee site. Do you have any information about, based on people's registration or otherwise, demographic information about people who have visited or commented, or whether they're city residents or business owners, or if so, what neighborhood they live in, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I mean, it does have their usernames, which can be helpful. I think you could look up their like demographic data if they chose to respond to certain things when you sign up. So like when you sign up, it has like demographic data you're required to respond to. So it's tied to the username. And there might be a way for me to pull a report on that, but I don't know if it's as easy as it would be for like a survey versus comments, but I can look into it. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how useful it is because it's not a representative sample. It was just a question that occurred to me, not actually on this project, but on the city council goals survey. I know that there's some folks out there that are organizing people to weigh in who may have contacts that are not actual like residents of Milwaukee. And I wasn't sure whether there's any way for you all to get a sense of like whether the people weighing in actually have a direct connection to the city or not.
Yeah. I actually, so now that I'm looking more into it, I do actually have some of this real-time data on I believe it's on the people that commented. And I can see here that majority of people that live in Milwaukee, and then there's like 3 out of some that are in unincorporated Clackamas County, but a majority are in the city of Milwaukee. Yeah, but yeah, in real time, I can pull up that data. So if I was seeing, yeah, I don't see numbers that are skewing to people that aren't here. So that's probably good.
That's a good point, Dan, particularly for Councilor Beatty, maybe something to think about for how the goals and all that is tabulated as you're drawing those conclusions, but that's a good point. Sorry.
It's interesting because I think the same group that Daniel may be alluding to will also probably be generating comments on the tree code here. So that same phenomenon may be happening, later in this process for us too. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. Great. Okay. Any other questions about the open house or sort of the things that people are asking really great questions. It's been really fun, to read it and sort of see what people, and it's been really, I'm glad that we've, been answering. It's kind of great to see kind of what kinds of questions people are coming up with as they're reading things. It's good practice to kind of figure, okay, are we telling the story in a way that people are understanding? Are they drawing different conclusions, or, oh, how did they get there? Let's think about how we're messaging, or making sure that we're clear and accurate in how we're sharing the information. So it's been a good test for us as well. That's really good. Okay, so we're going to move on to cottage clusters. Let me share my screen. And Pauline, want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to jump in. Excited to have a focused conversation with this smaller group. It really will allow us to dive into the material. So what we're going to do tonight is present, first of all, just an overall kind of primer on cottage clusters as a housing type. And I'll apologize in advance because I know that a handful of you were on multiple other committees that have worked on this in depth, both in the Cottage Code Cluster Feasibility Study and in the Affordable Housing Strategy. So consider it review, but we want to get everybody up to the same level of knowledge about the cottage cluster housing type. So we're going to initially look at it as a specific type, more broadly, and then we're going to look in greater depth at how the House bill has defined cottage clusters and some of the specifics there, because that House bill is our guide or our benchmarks for the proposed amendments that we're putting forward. And so once we all have a good shared understanding of the housing type and some of the specific design and development issues, Vera is going to walk us through 2 specific examples to help look at the proposed code amendments so we can get any of your questions and make sure that you all understand what we're proposing. So to that end, I'm going to talk about cottage clusters more generally. And I would caveat, part of the reason that we're looking at cottage clusters specific housing type as opposed to many of the other housing types that we've talked about, you know, the duplex, triplex, quadplex, and townhouses, is that this particular housing type is very interesting to the city of Milwaukee for a handful of reasons. And I'll cover those after I explain it a little more generally. So cottage clusters can be made up of either detached or attached homes. The really defining feature is that they're clustered around a shared open space. And you can see that in these examples here. It could be a open area like these green spaces. It could be a courtyard or a commons. But it's the arrangement of those cottages around a shared space. And so there's some sense of common areas as well as those private spaces. The parking is not usually provided with each individual unit. It can be, but often it's, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, clustered all together and off in one portion of the site so that there's more space again for that common open space in the middle. And again, that has an added benefit of people passing each other and interacting, another common aspect to it. So the cottages are usually small in size. And I want to explain something here, which was also in the memo in your packet, which is what we mean when we say a building footprint. So a building footprint is everything of the building that touches the ground. And you can actually see that really clearly in that upper left-hand graphic. So it's not the same thing as the area of the cottage, because there could be upper stories. So this red cottage in the bottom left-hand corner, for example, would have a larger square footage than just its building footprint. The building footprint would just be the ground floor there. So cottages will have a smaller footprint. So while a detached single home might be, kind of depends on what part of the country you're living in, but it could be, you know, in the 2,000 to 3,000 square foot range. A cottage could be more in the 900 to 1,400 square foot range. And some of that is also because there's often not an attached garage. And I see that Councilor Beatty, did you have a question about that?
Well, I had a question actually at the start where you said detached and attached. I guess I've always thought of them as detached. When you say attached, do you mean like they could be a duplex, or do you mean like they could be a row of townhomes?
Yeah.
And so how are we distinguishing between townhomes and cottage clusters in cottages in that scenario? Sorry.
I'm glad to see that your unnamed cat made an appearance. Good timing. That was the time to come in. So absolutely, it's a good question. And one of our examples is going to go into that in more detail. And it's one of the design issues that we want to discuss with the group to get a better sense. So generally, yeah, a duplex or a triplex type setting. But I think what you see is the more we get in depth into these housing types, you start to realize the distinctions between housing gets pretty amorphous or hard to pin down. You know, what if it's 2 units, one stacked on top of each other, you know, if it is a quadplex, but it's not going to be a townhouse. There's really a big distinction, which, so I'm glad you asked that question. That townhouse really is a row of attached units with common walls between them. And in this case, there may be a handful of units that are attached, but again, generally the design is a cluster of individual building footprints around a common space. And a lot of that has to do with the lot size. So we're going to get into that. Along with that common open space, they'll often have a shared resource or amenity. I'm thinking of this great example in Portland where there's along with the cottages, there's a house space at the end that's a guest house. And so anyone that lives in one of those cottages can have their family or friends come and stay in that guest house. It also could be a garden area, a workshop, a meeting space. And again, we covered this in the packet, but I just want to go over the fact that this is a housing type. It's not an ownership type. So co-housing is more of is an ownership type. So if there was to be a cottage cluster developed as a co-housing development, there could be a common kitchen as a resource, and that could be a shared space. So this is definitely a housing type that lends itself to that co-housing model. This is an important distinction, and we'll get into part of the reason that makes cottage clusters such an interesting housing type is the units could be on their own lots. So if you look at the upper left-hand example here of the Salish Pond cottages, you can see each home is on its own lot, and those are ownership units. And so that's on its fee simple lot is what it's called. But then if you were to look at the co-housing example on the bottom right hand, those units are on a single lot. And so that's a different ownership structure. So this gets into the different ownership structures around this housing type. So those are the general characteristics. I'm going to take a moment and see if anyone has any questions about those.
Can I just jump in really quick, Pauline, on the when you're talking about the co-housing example down here? So if as owner, the units themselves are very likely ownership units, but it's a condominium type of situation. So you own your building, you own in common the land, and so everyone is sort of sharing all of that stuff. But so you can still own the building, but you don't have, but your building is not on its own lot that you own, like in the Ross Chapin project, the Salish Pond project. So that's the difference as well.
Thank you. That's great clarification. Yeah. Sharon, I see you have a question.
I belong to an online group called Retiring Single Women, and there's a lot of interest in cottage clusters among that group for aging in place and having, you know, some natural supports network. It seems to me the challenge, though, is that somebody has to drive the initiative, and if there were to be development of cottage clusters, it seems like that might be a prerogative that's steered by the council and maybe in partnership with a nonprofit developer or whatever. And maybe I'm getting ahead of the conversation, but it seems waiting for it to happen will be a long wait.
Do you mean, can I ask Sharon, do you mean sort of waiting for someone to build a cottage cluster development? Is that what you mean? Or
right, like I think that there is a lot of interest in this kind of housing, but the interest does not equal the skill or leadership needed to make it happen.
mm-hmm.
Well, and I think there are developers who do this, but they aren't necessarily addressing that market that you're talking about, right? I mean, I also have a friend for 10 years. She's been saying this is what she wants to do when she retires, is she wants to have a community like this with her friends, her fellow gardeners or whatever. You're right. I mean, I don't know if there's a nonprofit that helps groups like that somehow pull, you know, with advice and pulling together the strategy. It's a good question.
One of the example projects that we're going to talk about is built by Orange Splot. So Eli in Portland has built a couple of these things, and they're and one of them in particular is a co-housing development, and we're going to talk about that. And a couple, I think it's 3 of the units within that development were built as affordable or income restricted units. So there's a way that kind of pulling together the folks that know how to do these things with other, you're right, it's sort of like a match.com kind of getting folks together that can do make the project happen, but also insert the affordability component as well in that. So we can talk a bit more about that when we get to that example, but you're bringing up a great point, Sharon, to sort of how can we get these to happen? Is there, and we'll be chatting a little bit about this as well as part of this conversation. Some of the things that we would like to explore, what kinds of incentives can we embed within the code that can help incentivize more income restricted or something, development like that? Is there a way that we can steer folks to that development type as well? But you raise a great point.
I want to know, I see that Eugene, you had a question, but I wanted to just jump in and add one more point here, which is that I think the House bill is also tried to make it much easier for an individual property owner to be more flexible and to do different things with their property. So also another one of those examples, Vera, is there's the existing home on the lot, and maybe even be more than one existing home, and they've developed the property behind them and taken their lot and split it out and created new homes on it. And that, I think the House bill is very cognizant of and tried to make sure that was an opportunity. And I think the other question that comes up for me and what you're describing is, well, could there be some type of a conversion? And then what is the amount of cottages that you can fit on an individual lot? And those are exactly the types of issues that we'll get into in these design studies that we're going to present. So on the smaller end of things, could someone that owns, let's say, a long, narrow lot in Ardenwald and has a desire to develop something like that, is that going to be possible? Or if a developer is coming in and consolidating and creating a larger lot, or purchasing one of the already existing larger lots, what types of issues come up there? Eugene, did you still have a question?
Oh, yeah, I do. I was remembering one of our previous meetings where we tried to define what equity means to people. And one of the members of the committee was saying that options are very important. And I agree. ADUs and triplexes and duplexes and cottage clusters and row houses are all options. But what I find missing, like the graphic that's on the screen now shows 2 photographs and 2 like diagrams essentially. And what it really comes down to is the affordability. And unless you can kind of measure in some matrix how much less expensive this type of housing is to a low income or a low middle income person looking for housing, it's academic. I mean, it sounds great, but you got to get down to the brass, to the nuts and bolts of it. That's all I have to say.
Absolutely. It's something we're really cognizant of, and I appreciate you raising it. It's something that we've talked a lot about with staff, and it's kind of jumping ahead. Part of the reason that this housing type is so interesting in the city of Milwaukee, because of the stated objectives from the comprehensive plan and the affordability housing strategy of how to increase the range of housing and the housing choices and to bring in those more affordable options. So I would point out that I think there's a couple of things that can happen here. One is this is a great model for a nonprofit or affordable housing developer. And I know that Habitat for Humanity is actively pursuing projects. And this is something they have not been allowed to do before. And so by opening it up with the zoning, there could be potentially some income restricted projects that would be possible that wouldn't have before. And that really great added benefit of a income restricted project mixed into a neighborhood rather than only allowed to be in a certain portion of the city because that's where the zoning only permits it. So yeah.
Can I just add one more thing? I read Lisa Bailey was kind enough to include the recent survey from Clackamas County. And I noticed that some of the objections from people who answered the survey were compatibility issues. In other words, how is this cottage cluster thing going to fit next to my 4-story, acre and a half house just down the way? So that's a key component of gaining neighbor and community buy-in to recognize how this can really help a lot of people. And I'm not sure how you would overcome that resistance because it's just entrenched. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. And I'm glad that you've pre-seen all the aspects of my presentation. So I'm glad you're going to come along for this journey because you basically laid out all the points that we're going to get into here. I would also note on the price issue that another aspect that comes from these is that they're going to be, they may not end up being an affordable home, but they're a less expensive home. And having additional product, housing product on the market will then take off some of the drain that's happening on the housing market as is now. So I, for example, along with many other people, spent a lot more on housing than I wanted to because that was the option that I could find. And so rather than having people reach, they can find a product that's more within, and then it will reset the market. So that's another important aspect and another reason that we're looking at this housing product. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please, Vera, and please keep all these great questions coming.
Are there a couple of comments in the chat that we need to kind of bring up? I don't know. I just see that there's chat, but I can't see the actual chat.
It was Councilor Beatty just wanted
Okay.
us to send updates on the Salish Pond development after the fact. But
Got it.
that's it. No questions.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So these are getting to some of the questions that have already been raised. And I think there's a new thing I would add to the advantages today after our initial meeting, which is that this is a great housing type for pet owners, right? Because there's that open green space. I hadn't thought about that, but now I know. So the cottage type can be really ideal for a smaller household. So it can be for someone that is choosing to age and they want to stay in their neighborhood, but they don't want to own a large home and have to do all the maintenance that comes with that. They just like a smaller home, and maybe their children have left, maybe they've lost a partner. It's also a great housing type, let's say, for a single parent who their children come some of the time. So they would allow someone to age in their neighborhood versus having to face that hard choice of, well, I really love, let's say, Island Station, but I can't stay in this large home. I have to move someplace into a condo in an urban setting, and that's not what I want. They do provide that option if done on fee simple lots for a home ownership or in the condominium structure. And so that's a really important because of that benefit that building wealth comes from the home ownership. So it's a really important aspect of this housing type. And this is directly to your question, Eugene, earlier, in terms of how do they fit into a single detached neighborhood. They have much more of a similar scale. There's those smaller units, lower heights, and the space in between the buildings that allows them to match more closely the sort of single family context that a property owner might be more used to. And there's maybe a little bit less resistance because of that. They're a really great option for an odd shaped lot. So let's say a flag lot, a long skinny lot, an oblong lot. It really allows a lot of flexibility and creativity to respond to the site context. And similar to that is that then allows the ability to preserve trees and to be really creative about where is the open space on the site? How can you take advantage of existing features and incorporate those? And you'll often see some just really lovely designs with historic or older mature trees that become a centerpiece. And so that's another, I think, way in which this housing type can blend into an existing neighborhood context because they maintain those trees and those open spaces. And also that common green may come right up to the street. And so it gives a sense of kind of a lawn and an open space that again mirrors those single detached units. And then I don't have the chat open, so if any chats come up, just let me know. I'm happy to stop. So I want to provide a little context here. I think it's a really interesting that here we are probably about 100 years after this was a much more widely developed housing type. And we've come to really full circle. So the example on the right is Pine Street Cottages. And I actually lived right around the corner from this in Seattle. It's a really lovely project. It was built in 1916. And it's 10 small cottages. They're at the time, they're about 420 to 500 square feet. They're a single bedroom, 1 story. There's no parking on site. And there is this shared open space in the interior of the lot. And so historically, cottages would have provided a house-like alternative to somebody that could have only afforded to rent an apartment, and they weren't able to buy a house. This would be an alternative. It's a smaller, more affordable option that was available at the time. So they were widely permitted. Now, as we've talked about and learned through this committee, once single family zoning became widely enacted, they basically became regulated out of existence. So a zoning code, things such as setting a larger minimum lot sizes or the number of houses that were required, that's really what would regulate these out of existence, is only one house may be permitted per lot. That is no longer accepted housing type. They also then would have had the, as a permitted land use, they would have been removed from codes. And so what was providing an outlet for people got regulated out of existence. I will point out at the same time, mortgages became much easier to get, and it was easier for someone to get a mortgage and to afford to buy a larger home. And that really shifted the market away from this. And now here we are 100 years later. It's hard to get mortgages. It can be expensive to buy a house. There's not a ton of supply. And so that's part of the reason that this housing type has become really interesting to people again. Next slide, please. So I just want to track a little how this housing type has started to come back to the forefront. Starting in the 90s and into the 2000s, there was a growing interest in cottage clusters. A lot of it had to do around issues of affordability and also the potential for infill and introducing more density into existing neighborhoods and providing more housing choice. And as I mentioned, this was not a permitted housing type. So actually the first cottage cluster housing development code that was adopted was in 1995 up in Washington. And it presented this as a possible option for the first time. And so then municipalities slowly started adopting these and trying to bring this housing type back. So Milwaukee, almost 10 years ago, did adopt a cottage cluster housing ordinance and has really targeted that as a desirable housing type. And to many of the points that people have already raised, they have not been developed. They weren't permitted, let's say, in the zones where the large lots would have allowed for it, for example. So they've been targeted through the housing affordability strategy, and then the city went even further and did a analysis of its existing cottage cluster code to see why were developments not being built. So there's been a lot of push now for about 10 years to really get this housing type developed. And I think some of that speaks to also the types of lots that are found in Milwaukee. There is those large lots that are available that would be well suited to this. There is a desire for a less expensive housing option. And there is a real emphasis on maintaining open spaces and preserving trees. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pause and let you read this so that I'm not going to read it for you. But what it is there's two definitions here. And there's how the OAR, which is the rules for House Bill, define the cottage cluster housing type, and then how the large city model code, which is more of a design emphasis, defines the cottage cluster. And I'm going to let you read it, and then if anyone has any questions, please ask away. Yeah, actually, let me wait 1 minute and see if anybody, I'll just wait one more minute before I answer your question, Councilor Beatty. You want to go ahead and ask your question, Councilor Beatty?
Sure. So I noticed in reading the packet that this statute says no fewer than 4, but the proposal here is as low as 3 or more. Why is that? Is it because it will allow it on smaller lots? I mean, I guess I understand since any lot can have a triplex, and we've sort of discussed that a triplex can be separate buildings. What more do we get from allowing it moving from 4 down to 3?
If I can jump in on that, and Pauline, please do as well. So Councilor Beatty, the OAR talks about no fewer than 4 per acre.
Oh.
And in our code, it's just 3 minimum. So it's not a per acre decision. So that's kind of, the OAR is kind of providing a density, I guess. And the way the code is laid out, the way we're proposing it, that, yeah, so it would be a 3 minimum, and that's in the lower density consolidated zone, the 3 minimum, the 12 maximum, so that we are, and it's more of a design decision around cottages being around, the common green as well. So trying to make it a little more flexible for design on smaller lots as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Daniel, have a question?
I have a question about so on the second part, the model code definition and the with the footprint of less than 900 square feet. So I haven't read the OAR or the rules. Is that threshold for the footprint a requirement of the rules in terms of local code provisions, and how does that 900 square feet relate to what you're proposing in the draft code?
So there's a little nuance in the difference between the OAR and the large city model code. And I feel like speaking as someone who's read them over and over and over now for a year, you kind of always find something new in them. But I think that generally speaking, the emphasis of the OAR is sort of like a benchmark, or a city has to do at least this. And the large city model code will often allow a city to go further, but not put in a must as much as you could allow. So a city could allow for a smaller footprint, but it doesn't say that you must. It's just opening up an avenue for a city to try to go a little bit further with what they're doing. What's not on the slide, and that we'll get into more in the proposed amendment, is that the large city model code adds, and Vera can probably correct me here if I state it, but the average building size across an entire cottage cluster. So the OAR just defines a minimum footprint, or sorry, a maximum square of footprint. But the large city model code allows for an average building size limitation throughout an entire cluster. And that is really targeted at making sure that you get smaller units and getting at that affordability piece.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, so the OAR does have a maximum footprint of 900 square feet. But as Pauline said, the large city model code gives us this average ability as well for the overall, for the size of the units, not the footprint necessarily. So, and that's what we've proposed in this code, is that it's still a maximum footprint of 900 square feet, but the average floor area of the units is 1,400 square feet. So it gives a little bit of wiggle room on kind of the size of the units, but not the footprint of the units. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I guess where I have a little bit of lingering confusion is, as I understand it, the code is implementing the legislation that essentially imposes requirements of cities and counties in terms of what they allow in their zoning code provisions. But preceding the legislation, and I think even after the legislation, cities still have authority to adopt provisions to allow for other things that are not required by the legislation, right? So it makes me still wonder, like, if a city wanted to say, okay, we're also going to allow cottage clusters with a footprint larger than 900 square feet, could a city do that?
No.
With one exception, I'll just point out one exception, which is that there is you're allowed to add an additional, I believe, 200
yep.
for a attached garage. But there was a lot of discussion around this because developers really push back on limitations on the footprint. Well, then really you get cottage cluster developments that are a bunch of large single detached homes around a common space. And that's not really the true definition or objective for what this housing type is defined by this legislation, or how the city of Milwaukee has been pursuing it. So there is that small thing, but a city is allowed to put some extra limitations. It's just kind of a give and take that you want to address the design concerns around having more density, more residents, but you also don't want to make it more costly and more onerous for someone to develop middle housing. And I will say there's probably the majority of discussions with DLCD have been around the cottage cluster type and townhomes for those reasons, because I think there are a lot of design issues that you'd want to address, but you don't want to make it too complex for someone to actually develop one of these.
Well, and I think, and part of what comes into here too is this idea of, making sure that it is a maximum footprint of 900 square feet. Yes, there's an average for, overall square footage. And yes, they made this allowance for the attached garage, which starts to not be a cottage anymore, but okay, because there was so much discussion about it. But part of there are trade-offs between, a cottage cluster development and a detached quadplex, for example. There are different setbacks, there are different design development standards that go with a cottage cluster. And so the idea of keeping them, there are some limitations on the size because you get kind of a break on, on the perimeter setbacks on some of these. So there needs to be some give and take. And I mean, I understand, sort of as part of this whole conversation with folks, with the builders and so on, doing all of this. But, when we've been talking about this a little bit too, about how, well, here are all the cottage cluster, requirements, because there are, requirements for cottage clusters that are different from doing a detached quadplex on the same kind of lot. You could look at a development and are those cottages or is it a detached quadplex? But the development standards are different. There's still 20-foot setback, for the quadplex. There's not for the cottage cluster, but the houses are smaller and there has to be a common green. And so there are different design standards that go with that cottage cluster to offset, a smaller setback or something like that. And so I think, and I'm sure I'm not sort of talking to your or speaking to your question, Daniel, but it's more about, the OAR gives us some certain things. And so our cottage cluster code is, no, it's a maximum of 900 square feet. They're intended to be small. And that's the idea. And if you want to build something bigger, you're going to want to look to a detached quadplex or something else instead. And you'll need to work through those design and development standards. So it's trying to create flexibility, but still get to where we're trying to get, which is smaller units and hopefully more or less expensive housing. That's kind of the idea. Does that clarify things at all for you? Maybe.
I think so. I mean, I guess what it gets at, and just the comment that I would offer both for staff and for Councilor Beatty is, I mean, it depends on who the developer is, right? Like whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's an existing landowner. But for-profit developers, many of them are going to be seeking to maximize their profit with a reasonable level of certainty about what the outcome is going to be and the ability to sell or lease out whatever they build. And so I think as this project moves forward, it's just going to be really important to sort of like step back and look at the set of options and how they compare with one another. Because if there's one particular option that is going to be dramatically more profitable for developers, that's where the market's going to head. And the other stuff is going to languish on the shelf.
It's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you. I also want to just point out, maybe I haven't said this clearly, but our starting point for development standards, while we took into account everything from the OAR, our starting point was the recommendations from the cottage cluster code feasibility analysis and capturing all of those recommendations. So that was really our starting point, is trying to go further and to look at things that the legislation does allow a city to do. And so that was the starting point for our proposed amendments. I just want to make that clear. Yes, Councilor Beatty.
Oh, there we go. I couldn't unmute myself. So thinking about what Daniel said and then what Pauline just said, as I recall, some of Eli Spivak's developments have like a combo of like a big house that was there and some smaller cottages around it and stuff. So I would want to make sure we I mean, I'm okay with the 900 square foot. I mean, I'm okay with the idea that developers may not think this is their maximum buy-in. I think there will be enough people, and maybe it is a tool that is more for nonprofits or people who are developing for seniors aging in place or whatever. But I do want to make sure we don't zone out that possibility of the combo of the existing house and the smaller cottages around it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. We'll definitely make sure that's the case.
Yeah, and one of the examples that we have is one of Eli's projects, and that's exactly what happened. There was sort of the parent house, and then the rest of the, and it's basically, yeah, it's a cottage co-housing kind of thing. But yes, but the main house is still there with all of the other cottages. Yeah, and we'll be looking at that in a second. Okay. Shall we? Let's go back to, here we are. And I think we sort of covered this part already, I think, a bit, Pauline, but maybe do you want to?
No,
Go
I
back
think,
over
right.
again.
I mean, it's been a very iterative conversation, which I appreciate. Yeah, I think we've covered all this. This is just kind of, Daniel, the question that you were raising in terms of what are you required to do, but we've gone over a lot of that. So let's just jump ahead. And these are some of the questions, and I was trying to read Sharon's comment in the chat as well. Yeah, I think to this end, I mean, absolutely, once we are changing the rules of the game about what is permitted on every lot, it will change the market for each lot. But I do think one of the things that this code, as we're putting it forward, allows is, and maybe Vera can speak a little bit more about this in terms of also what's coming with the state bill. I'm terrible with numbers, sorry, 458.
458, yep.
Okay, thanks. I have number dyslexia. I rearranged it. So Senate Bill the 458 is how lots are being split up. So I think what we're continuing to do with these building rounds of legislation is make it more and more possible for different configurations on different lots. So that, Sharon, I think that would open up more lots than just the most obvious ones that may be purchased ahead of by a for-profit developer.
Okay.
So I wanted to walk through some of the important design issues and look at them. And this is sort of, again, helps you to walk through our proposed code. It's also a reminder of what the House bill requires us to do. And the idea behind these topics is, well, if you're adding a larger number of homes and therefore people to a lot, to try to offset the impacts of that increase of people on a lot, both for the surrounding properties, for people on that street, and for the neighborhood and city overall. So some of the specific issues that you want to look at is that building separation and the distance between cottages. And this is a key feature. And this also gets into that question of attached versus detached. What is that building separation between attached units? Is that the same, or should that be different? Should that increase, let's say, from 6 feet to 10 feet? And maybe now is a good point to mention that what we have put forward now is a proposed draft code, but it's really, as Vera says, like a starting line. And moving forward, we're continuing to do at UrbsWorks some detailed studies of this particular housing type to start to look at these issues in greater depth and to get feedback from the CPIC and then the Planning Commission and City Council to work through these exact design issues that we're presenting tonight. So there's the separation in between individual buildings. Then there's the number of units. And I'm not going to say on a lot, because the way that the code is written now is it's the number of units per cluster. So if you think it's kind of like a Lego set, you can stack these, well, if you have your number of cottages and your common green and your parking, that's kind of one, like your first Lego packet. Stop me if anyone has kids and knows what I'm talking about here. You open the first Lego packet and that's one set of the Lego, right? Then you open the second packet, it starts getting messy. No, then you add on an additional cluster. So the number of units in one of those Lego packets, one of those cluster units, and then their associated common greens. So looking at what's the right number and should you set a maximum number? A lot of that has to do with infrastructure. It has to do with a level of sort of social infrastructure and the sociability of the development model. Then how much common open space? And so that's thought about in terms of a percentage or amount of area per unit, kind of conglomerated into one common open space. And so you can see in these drawings, the difference between the three options that we modeled out here in terms of what's the right amount of common open space. And with all of these, it's that balancing act between we want to preserve the advantages of the housing type but make sure that it still can be developed and it's not precluding a less expensive housing option. So, a deluxe cottage cluster, we want to create a code that's flexible, that allows someone to go over and above, but that does set a minimum for what is required. We've talked about the issue of attached versus detached, and let's get into parking. So you can see first we've presented cottage cluster projects on a 20,000 square foot lot. So on a larger lot, we're looking at, in these examples, there's one parking space per each unit. And that's what the city must require, a minimum of one. So if we turn to the next slide, we can look at a cottage cluster project on smaller lots. And so we didn't even look at the 5,000 or the 7,000 square foot lot, because right away, as we've learned over the course of our work sessions here, is that impact of parking on a site. So here we're showing one space per unit on the left, and that drops us down to 4 cottages. I think it's likely that a project like this wouldn't really pencil out and may not be built on a 10,000 square foot lot. So the option on the right is showing what our proposed amendments allow, which is to permit some or all of the parking to be provided on street through a modification process. And so in this case, you'd get 6 cottages on the lot and the parking would be provided on the street.
And what is that separate review process? Is it like, are we making it as easy as possible?
That's a great question. And we were actually just discussing that 2 days ago. And I think this is, if we keep in mind, I think throughout the course of this, if there's certain objectives that we have coming from the comprehensive plan, say around affordability or around preservation of open space, and keep in mind kind of what levers could we push and pull, and process and cost are really some of those things. So for example, could you waive fees for that process if someone's providing a less expensive or income restricted cottage? Yeah, that's definitely an option that's worth discussing.
Yeah, especially if we're trying to promote this sort of project, it pencils out much better and more affordably. If there's 6 units, like let's decrease the fees or the process, the time that it takes to go through that review process. Because yeah, the one parking spot per unit requirement just gets in the way of a lot of stuff, and especially on those previous images you had up, it's like a quarter of the property is parking. And thinking about like if there is this requirement that we have to have one per unit, like can we require that like half of those parking spots are using pervious pavement or other substrates? That's not just creating this new urban heat island effect. in these communities? Like what are the different things that we can do to make sure those parking spaces can actually be beneficial to our open space goals, our stormwater goals, and whatnot?
I just wanted to jump in that we're not required to require a parking space. We can't require more than one.
Thank you.
So it's, yeah, so we can in our code, we could require fewer than or less than one space per unit. What we've done in the draft code that we've put out there for folks to look at, in the lower density consolidated zone, we're looking at one space per per cottage or per dwelling as a minimum. And then in the higher density or the high density consolidated zone, it's 0.5, with the understanding that they're likely smaller, potentially smaller lots, and making that. So that's kind of where it is right now. And we've been looking at our existing parking modification process as a process in which all of these kind of alternative parking ideas, would be put into that basket. It's a type 2 process. It does allow for NDA and neighbor comment, but it's a planning manager decision. So it's not planning commission. So it does have public notice, but it's still an internal sort of a staff level decision with, and the approval criteria. And I've been taking notes on my version of this for the last several weeks about ways, are there other, if we're still going to, assuming we're using the parking modification process as a way to address site-specific considerations or project-specific considerations when it's related to parking, let's bolster the approval criteria or the things that the planning manager will be looking at as a way of just making the decision of allowing fewer parking spaces. Things like proximity to transit or the street network in front, there's ample on-street parking. I'm just making that up. Are there ways that we can get to the site-specific nature of any of these projects through that process? Instead of, and what can be difficult is trying to write code for any potential circumstance, right? So it is adding a layer of review, this type 2, but all of these middle housing types are permitted by right. There is no land use review for these things. That's why the standards matter. So making sure that folks can kind of go straight to building permit for these things. But if they need an exception or a modification to their parking, there is a review process for that, but it's a type 2. It's not the easiest version, but it's the one that allows still for public comment, but keeps it at the staff level for a decision. So I don't know if that answers your question, Micah, but that's sort of kind of how we're thinking about the parking piece. But I just wanted to make sure it was clear that we can't require more than one space, but we're allowed to ask for one. So
I guess my overall statement on that is I think we should not be starting at 1 per unit, but it should be maybe 0.5 to 0.25 on the smaller areas. Like if we're trying to maximize these other priorities of ensuring that we're preserving open space, making place for trees, adding density, we can't be continually making space and requiring space to park cars when there is lots of other options, whether that's on-street parking or in lots of areas of the city, close access to walkable and like transit.
Yep. That's going to be a key question for all of our hearings, I think, at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think that, close to transit is an easy reduction. Council has done that before in downtown and elsewhere. I think but not close to transit. Milwaukee is a place where every road, every street in this town is different. And even just in the same neighborhood, in Ardenwald, you've got Filbert Street, which is really wide and long and doesn't have very many cross streets. And so it has tons of street parking. And then you have 37th Street, which is barely enough for one car to go down, let alone two cars to go, I mean, one segment of 37th Street, where you can't even have two cars passing and both of them stay on the pavement. So we have a huge diversity in the quality of our streets and their ability to accommodate on-street parking. So I applaud the staff for trying to find a way to have that be determined site specific. One thing I wanted to ask about here, well, one thing that this slide clarified for me, I guess, was when I read the packet, it said that the proposed code said that there had to be 6 feet between eaves of cottages. And I wondered if cottages had to have eaves. And I guess reading this first bullet, I'm guessing cottages don't have to have eaves. They can just have roofs that stop at the wall. Correct? Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, to me, 6 feet is a pretty small separation. I like the 10 feet better. Yeah, that was one of the things where I felt like the study that was done in 2019 was overly aggressive, frankly, in the amount of setback between buildings. But that's my personal feeling. Yeah.
Dan and then Jean.
Just briefly wanted to say I agree with Micah's comments regarding parking, and I would also recommend that when required parking is stated, to explicitly say minimum requirements or minimum required parking, so that folks, are always sort of aware that if a particular developer wanted to provide more parking, unless there's some maximum that also applies, that the market might be able to do more than what's required.
Good point. Thank you. Jean.
Oh, I just had a kind of a silly question, and that is, let's say you have a cottage cluster and there's 6 cottages and there's space for 4 parking spaces. Is that possible under the scenario we're talking about?
It is.
How would those occupants of the clusters get access to the parking spaces? Would it be first come, first serve? Would first cottage cluster owner in get a designated spot? I'm just wondering. It's just kind of a hypothetical.
Typically, I believe it could be, as Mike is pointing out, you could buy a space, in which case it would be a first come, first serve type situation, or it could be bundled. And then that would allow, again, that's where you get down to what is true choice. Well, I could decide to spend $75,000 less on my unit and it comes without a parking space.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. You ready for this?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna hand off the show to Vera, but what we have here is we're gonna walk through 2 specific examples, and we wanted to use them to look at our proposed amendments in the R2, which is the less dense zone, and then the R1 and the R1B. And so we have a map here just to remind everyone of, get used to the new normal. What are the zones?
Right.
So that will sort of be your orientation. And then we're going to walk through each of those examples and have a poll question at the end to get a temperature read.
Okay, so again, the R2 is our lower density zones, and the R1, R1B are our higher density zones. And the examples are an actual built project. This is one of Eli's project. This is Cully Green up in Northeast Portland. This is the actual site plan for the project. So we have all the stats that go with, and then we have a prototype so it's a pretend scenario for the lower density zones. In the higher density zone, we've proposed in the code that you could have attached cottages. So that's part of this idea that we've got. And we'll have some more details, drawings in a second. And then in the R2 or the lower density, right now the code would only allow for detached cottages. So think about that for a second, because we do have a poll question about this. So This is the Cully Green development in Northeast Portland. It's a co-housing project, and it does not have any singleton detached cottages. They're duplexes, but they're 2s and 3s, and the parent house is on the lot as well. The parent house is down here in the lower left of the site plan. So it's this guy was the parent house on the lot. The lot is sort of a weird shape. It's kind of it's sort of a jig jag this way. And this is Northeast 47th, sorry, and then this is Northeast Going Street. And their parking is in each sort of, so this is kind of like a cluster sort of, and then this is another sort of cluster with a main green area in the middle. This is the view. This top picture is the view from Northeast Going Street. So this is the entrance to the development at the sidewalk. And so this is what it looks like kind of looking in to the development. And then these pictures down here, this lower one is sort of in the main green area where there's a cluster of trees, and the common building is there, the shared building. And then this is one of the attached sort of the duplex type cottages with their shared big garden space. That's part of the cottage, the cluster as well. So this is sort of a blown, this is the larger size of the site plan. You can see there are 23 dwelling units on the site. 3 of them were built as affordable units with the help of I think it was a community land trust development or affordable housing developer did 3 of them. And there's, I think one of them is in this cluster, one of them is in this cluster, and one is in this cluster. So they're not all in one spot, they're separated out. Parking spaces. There are 20 parking spaces and they are assigned. I don't know what the fee was for them, but they are actually assigned spaces. So it's not first come, first serve. They go with the unit. Everyone has private green space. If I'm going to scoot up for a second. So everyone's private green space is this area that's sort of in front of their unit. And then these shared spaces are the big common shared areas here that you can see in these pictures. So everyone has a little bit of front porch and some green space, and then a big thing of shared spaces. There are community buildings. There's a big bike barn that has a ton of bike racks. I don't remember how many there are in there, but there's a lot, way more than there are units. There's at least 2 racks per unit, I think was the number. There's a tool shed area, and then there's a common house here. That has space for folks if they had family to come stay in. There's also a big shared kitchen. They can have meetings, what have you as part of the project. And we have here on the left sort of an example of 2 adjoining properties in Milwaukee that could accommodate something like this top part of Cully Green. So just to kind of get a sense of scale of what sort of existing lots here in the city could work for something like that. Again, the footprint for the units are a little bit less than 500 to about 815 square feet. Total area on the units are almost 1,000 to 1,500 square feet for the total square footage of the unit. And then this is a street elevation of what it looks like kind of at the street and these are the cottages, or this is the development here, and then this is what the adjoining building looks like, and the adjoining. So you can see in the street cross section that it's very comparable to what's already happening on the street. So that whole idea of compatibility, Jean, that you were talking about, it fits in. I'll use the term fits in to the existing neighborhood. So that's the built example of something that has attached cottages. Any questions about that? Anything strike you as interesting or not about this? I think it's pretty great, actually, I will say. And it's pretty new. We actually went, funny story, when a few of us actually went up there, and we were just sort of walking by to take some pictures, and just as we were walking by, a couple that had just bought a unit and had just moved in a week before from Minneapolis pulled in and said, do you want to come see it? And so they just let us walk in and they showed us a bunch of it. So we walked all the way through it and they were really, really nice, but they were a retired couple. And it was very deliberate that this co-housing development is also a variety of ages. It's not all one particular age group in there. It was very deliberately sort of marketed and sold as a multi-generational development. Okay. And then this is what we're calling our unbuilt prototype of a site plan that we're looking at sort of as an experiment or a SketchUp of a potential development of 8 cottages in our lower density zone. And so they're all detached cottages. And so we're on a pretty typical 20,000 square foot lot, sort of longer-ish and skinny here in Milwaukee. 8 dwellings. Building separations 10 feet. You can read the statistics here. We've got a footprint of a little over 600 square feet, total area of a little over 900 square feet for each unit. Common area sort of in the middle, and we've got 8 parking spaces. And then this street elevation would show, with all the neighboring houses on the street, what this development would look like. So this building here is this building here. So when you're looking at it, it's as if you're standing here. So you can see that the scale of the cottages and of the development at the street level is very comparable to the surrounding homes and what's there as well. Any questions about that? Okay. And then these are just a couple more examples of sort of what it might look like sort of on the less dense sort of detached cottage cluster idea to something that is a little more dense. This one's in Rhode Island of attached cottages sort of fronting on the green. And so this is the picture right from the sidewalk of the development. So you can imagine something like that in your neighborhood or across the street from you. Any questions about the developments? We have a poll question.
I have
yeah,
a question
please.
and a comment. So
Sure.
the question is what I guess the draft code provisions are regarding the design of the parking, especially as related to the street frontage. And the comment is, I've noticed that a lot of these photos of sort of like model projects, whether contemporary or historic, they're photos where the parking is either not visible or there is no parking on the site. And they're presented sort of as like the ideal, like, wouldn't you want this? And to the extent that parking's being required, I think it's really important to provide people with photos that are realistic in terms of like, this is an example of what you might get based on what the city might require.
So as you're talking, I'm going to actually pull up, and I should have dropped these into the slides because I took pictures from at Kelly Green at the sidewalk of the parking areas, and I didn't include them in the slideshow. So I'm really glad that you asked that. So if you'll wait a second, I can show you. Okay, let me share my screen really quick because I just found them. Okay, so again, this is the Cully Green neighborhood. And so the first picture is this parking area here in the lower spot. So this is, I'm standing on the street at Northeast 47th Ave, and this is the parking area. And then these are the cottages that go with the development. The main house that started, or it was the property, or the original house is sort of here. It's off the side, sorry. But yeah, so this is the parking area here. And then this is the other parking area off of Northeast going. So I'm right on the sidewalk of Northeast going, looking at the parking area. And then these are the back of the units. So I don't know if that's helpful, but thank you for bringing that up, Dan. I appreciate it. I should have put that in there. We're trying to hide it, but it was a good thing. No, but it was good to bring up, and I should have dropped them into the slideshow, and I'll amend the slideshow and drop these in there so that when we post it online, it'll have these pictures in there as well. Thank you for that. So. Okay.
Jean has a question.
I just have a quick question about parking, and I've seen a number of like apartment buildings or upscale condos where there's parking and they have a covered area and they're actually, there's lighting. So for some people, if their parking space is quite a ways away and it's dark and they come home, there's a security issue. Or if there's heavy rain and snow that would encumber them and getting ready to leave, that could be a big selling point. And I'm wondering, what are successful models in terms of the parking on street or on ground levels with the amenities they have? Any thoughts?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, these ones here at Cully Green, they aren't covered.
Right.
And we were there in the daytime, so I don't know what the lighting situation is at night. I mean, that's a good question. And I'm sure we could reach out to Eli and ask kind of what that, is there ground lighting, for the walkways, because, folks will have to kind of meander on a sidewalk. I just don't know the answers. Pauline, do you know what that site plan looks like at night? Do they
I
have?
don't know with that site plan, but I think it's definitely worth looking at the existing city of Milwaukee lighting standards for multi-units.
Mhm.
And seeing if there's something that's relevant. And so it's always the tricky question of, well, then are you requiring more than you require? I mean, that is an added cost. So maybe it's not that it's required, but you do reference it. So if developer is to provide lighting, it should meet these standards, but it's not required. And then those standards for multi-units would take into account all the things that you're bringing up, Eugene, in terms of lighting paths, the quality of the light. But, lighting code is very specific and would address those concerns for sure.
And insofar as Eugene talked about covered parking, I mean, obviously parking on the street is not going to be covered parking, but parking on the site, I mean, we do have some examples in Milwaukee, like one of the condos over on Lava Drive near the Waverly have like long carport basically for, I mean, some of their parking is uncovered and some is covered. And obviously, I mean, there is a cost to doing that. That does increase the cost, but building a carport over just a roof, basically over 4 cars or 6 cars is of course far less expensive than building individual garages. So, I mean, those are kind of things that markets tend to drive. I mean, I don't see the city requiring that. But I also, wouldn't want to see the city, precluding that if somebody wants to build it. Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah, and to that point, I think I know that Rick Williams looked very specifically at crafting parking code language that would allow flexibility, and it wouldn't preclude, for example, something that we built into the code is the ability for garages to be of such a height that you could have car stacking technology. If somehow that became something that worked in the market, we don't want to preclude that. So we did definitely with the parking standards try to build in flexibility, but again, let the market dictate to the points that Daniel is raising or Jean or that you've just raised, Councilor Beatty, so that someone can provide things, but they're not required to.
Okay. And I think, are there any other questions that we're on to? I think the first poll question, unless
I
there's
just-
no questions about that. Go ahead, Paul.
Daniel just was asking about the draft requirements for how parking is configured on site.
Oh, sorry.
If you wanna
Yes.
pull those up. There are some definitely specific standards around that. I just don't have it open. Let me see.
Yeah, I'm looking at it actually right here. So sort of like I'm reading it right now, but we do have that the parking spaces are supposed to be located together with parking spaces for other cottages in a common area. And they are supposed to be set back from the street. So we do have kind of what the longest dimension. They're actually many of them, we have them in our existing cottage cluster code. And so we've pulled them over into the new code as well. So we do have that they are to be set back from the street, but we don't have a dimension for that. So we probably want to look at that. It talks about if it's angled parking, it has to be at least 20 feet from the street. So we've got some standards for how that is designed. And if there are more than 8 units in a cottage cluster, there must be at least 2 separate parking areas. with a minimum of 4 per area. So we're trying to kind of split up the parking areas if we can. That might be something to look at, you know, to kind of see how much flexibility there is in the design, but trying to kind of not have a big parking lot in one part, and is there a way to split them up? But that might not always be possible given the separate driveway accesses and stuff. So we'll want to take another look at that when we do some design studies for our examples as we go through the adoption process, and make sure does it work, you know, when we design them out, and see if this is what we're looking for. But we do have design standards. I think we're just going to want to take another look at them again and make sure they're what we want in real life. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Any other pictures people want to see? Anything? All right, so we have a poll question specific to the idea of attached or detached cottages. It's kind of what we're trying to understand. Do we want attached cottages to be in all zones, or do we want them just in our high density zones? Right now, the idea of the attached cottages is just in our high density zones, but we wanted to understand what people thought about this idea. Okay, so there's only 4 of you, so it's easy to know if we got everybody. For the folks that aren't sure if we should allow the attached in the low density zone as well, can we ask what else would you need to know, or what are the other things that we should be thinking about as we're talking about the idea of attached cottages?
I had that. This is Micah. I had to switch to my phone, and
Okay.
I cannot find how to vote.
Oh,
The pop-up thing didn't come up, so I would have said all zones.
okay, great. Okay.
My only concern was the issue that Jean raised about detached houses being maybe more acceptable in more typically suburban style development.
Mhm.
So it isn't that I would be against them, but does permitting them mean that that would become the norm and make it more difficult for neighborhood acceptance?
That's a good point. Okay. It looks like.
And I put my
Mhm.
comment in the chat. I guess it's the question also relates to, like, what would the potential total building footprint or maximum building size be for cottage clusters and attached units as compared to the Jello mold that we've discussed for other kinds of middle housing?
Oh, that's a great point.
And I guess I have similar questions about the comments that Vera, you made earlier in the meeting about relative setback requirements on the perimeter of a lot.
So what we have right now are the so the side and rear setbacks are 5 feet, 10-foot front and rear setbacks for the cottage clusters themselves.
That all sounds fine to me, but I guess the question that I would have is, if it's appropriate for cottage clusters, why isn't that kind of easing on setback requirements also appropriate for other kinds of middle housing? So long as there's not, a differential in terms of overall height or, the Jello mold.
Right.
I think some of that, Daniel, has to do with that building footprint limitation.
But so the
it
idea,
would be like only a portion of that sort of side of the site, rather than maybe like extending the whole lot length, for instance, or width.
right. It's an interesting question too to think about if so the maximum building footprint per home is 900 square feet, but if they're attached, but you know, should we have a maximum number of how many can be attached, for example, or something like that? Might be something to think about. Okay. All right. Okay. Number attached. Great. Hope I can read my writing at the end of this meeting. I'm writing all this stuff down. Okay. Are there any other questions about comments or questions about cottage clusters before we move on to the next topic? And Dan, you brought up a great point of, you know, again, it's sort of that, you know, what are the right development standards for cottage cluster versus, I'll call it regular middle housing. And you've raised a good point about the setbacks and all of these things. I mean, you know, should they be the same? And I think that's something that we'll want to sort of understand. Does, you know, what are the trade-offs and do they make sense? And do those trade-offs make a cottage cluster more affordable, or I guess more streamlined to be able to build? You know, what works, what doesn't? Because if the idea is to get to something that is less expensive, easier to build as an income restricted kind of development type, do we have the right, are we matching up the right development and design standards to do that? And that's us testing the code against, you know, a pro forma actual development ideas, scenarios, that kind of thing. If I'm interpreting your question correctly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of it. I think the other piece is for some of those code provisions, they're sort of driven to some extent by the perceived impact to neighbors, right? And so from the perspective of neighbors, like if it's the total size of a structure or the setback for development, do they really care whether it's a cottage versus another kind of middle housing structure?
I had a couple additional questions on the draft code language. Is now a good time to raise them?
Yes, that's it's our next agenda item, Micah. So
Oh.
yes, yeah,
Okay,
that's
that are
where we're.
specific to the cottage cluster.
No, we're actually, well, we're moving for, oh, sorry. So you have specific code questions about the cottage cluster, not just the code. Yeah. Okay, sure.
So in the table on E, why I'm curious to understand the reason why there's a difference in impervious maximum percentage for the higher density versus the lower density lots. It goes from like 65 to 60.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose of that? And I would ask the same for why is there a different percentage of required for vegetation for the two different?
Yeah. And in our existing code for like single unit development as well, it's similar, that sort of thinking about smaller lots and sort of the overall kind of building or sort of neighborhood building type, or the overall density in those neighborhoods, they tend to have or they're allowed to have more lot coverage and less vegetation. In the higher density, understanding that they are the higher density zones, they have less of those things. And it sounds like you're suggesting that they should be the same. Do I have that right? Is that where you're going with that question?
There should be a higher required percentage of vegetation and a lower required impervious.
Got it. Okay.
And then to speak to that same issue, but in section F, I think 2-5, it states that the impervious space percentage max is of 75%. And it just seems that it should probably be lower and tethered more closely to like the urban tree canopy goal of 60-40, 60 or 40% tree coverage. And so if you have the same amount of space is required to be pervious and thus can hold that tree canopy.
Got it. Okay. Makes sense.
And then, yeah, just my general, within that code, I think just my general argument that I don't think we should be requiring one parking spot per Um,
Got it.
and that's it.
Okay. Great. All right.
Vera, can I add something real quick?
Please. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just sorry, I'm down in my basement doing laundry, so I don't have the best video feed. But I was just going to add that in the development tree code, there is a requirement for plantings to have appropriate soil volume of 1,000, I think, square feet of soil volume. So that hopefully will increase the capacity for more canopy, even if there is some either permeable or impervious surface on top, as long as the best management practices are allowed for those vegetation. So it could be possible that you go above, 60%. I mean, I'm all for more impervious. I mean, I'm all for more pervious surface and vegetation, but just there is some, it doesn't necessarily have to be an exact 60-40, but I do like that justification that Micah has.
Great. Okay. All right. And now I'm just going to zing over to our presentation real quick. So we wanted to, and we can come back to cottage clusters if things, of course, occur to you. But we just wanted to shift over to just the overall package of code amendments that we linked to for everyone to be able to take a look at. If you've had a chance, if you haven't, that's fine. We've got plenty of time as we work through things. But just wanted to open this up as, again, these draft amendments are a milestone. It's a starting point for the refinement as we move forward. They were developed based on, of course, the policy mandates from the comp plan, key issues and code concepts that we talked about with you folks with the CPIC, all of the feedback we got from the open houses, the overview amendments that we talked about with you folks at our last meeting. And now we have everything sort of available, ready to go in our new open house. You've seen this table before. It was in one of your packets, talking about how we're connecting the proposed amendments to the various comprehensive plan policies. Also talking about implementing the urban forestry management plan, climate action plan, housing affordability strategy. All of those things inform the code amendments, on top of the requirements of the House bill, of course, but it's really more about kind of how are we getting to the comprehensive plan policies as well. So wondering at this point, I'm going to stop sharing because we don't have more slides for this, but if folks have had time to take a look at any of the code sections, did anything jump out at you? Any general questions? It's fine, as we kind of move forward. If you have other questions, I think I put this in the email to everybody for this meeting. I'm happy to set up time to talk with folks to really dig through the code sections, or if there are particular details that you want to do, we're allowed to meet in person now. You can come in, we can do that too. Whatever works for folks. If there are particular sections that you want to get into the weeds about, this is the code that we'll be workshopping with the Planning Commission before we get to the hearings in September. So this is the time for refinement or making sure that things are clear. My version of the code has a lot of markups on it. I've been scribbling on this thing since we posted it. So, different things as we see kind of, oh, what about this? What about this? So we're continuing to tweak it a little bit and refine it. So that's where we are now. So certainly any questions or comments that folks have, but we still have, we have some time tonight. So if there's anything you want to dig into or ask any questions about or provide comments, we're happy to hear them now if you'd like to share anything.
Can also maybe start the conversation about incentives.
Oh yeah, there we go. Go ahead. Yep.
People don't have questions at the moment. And I don't know, maybe we don't need to do the poll question. It can just be a discussion of, so we've talked some about reducing parking for cottage clusters, but in particular, we want to know what are some areas that you think we, the city, and the land use code can incentivize for income restricted affordable developments to create a more cost-effective option for them. So whether that's reducing parking, it could be increased height to preserve trees, or even just because they're income restricted. Just so we can start a list, you can put them in the chat, or you can write them out as well, because we'll have that option in the planning commission hearings and city council hearings to bring up those ideas as well. They're just not in the draft proposal at the moment, but we want to find ways to actually incentivize income restricted affordable housing. And so any ideas you all have? I see Sharon already has her hand raised, so go for it.
Well, I know in the Housing Affordability Committee I was on, I'm forgetting what we called it, there was a way to get some dollars from developers of large developments that then could be used as incentives for affordable housing. So in my previous experience, and even looking at my building an ADU, I mean, the price when I first looked at building an ADU was about $120,000. Now it's closer to $300,000. So, and in my mind, $300,000 for an 800 square foot unit is not affordable. So I really think that in order to create affordability, there almost needs to be a direct buy down or incentive to the buyer, or income restrictions, or something other than just saying, you know, we're going to eliminate parking requirements, or we're going to require or allow you to eliminate a wall because we'll allow an attached cottage to attach cottages. That doesn't bring it down enough to an affordability standard. So I think you really have to plan in for affordability, and that requires either working with the land trust, having some buy down incentive money available, or mortgage products, or very specifically working with set asides for affordability.
Yeah, and you know, the land use code is definitely going to be one of many ways to tackle the affordable housing kind of crisis that we have going on. And so Sharon, like you said, we have all these other programmatic things that we've got in affordable housing strategies and the construction excise tax program. So we're going to try and come at it lots of different ways, but in terms of the code section, you know, if there's ways that we can help in this area as well, that would, you know, we want to try and do what we can.
Yeah, I would just, if I could, and Jean, I see your hand up. Give me one second. I think, and Sharon, you've raised a great point. I mean, it's the way to get to affordable housing is going to be through a myriad of ways. It's going to be, is there a way through the code that we can reduce the construction cost in the ways that we can? And there are a lot of things that we can't control: the price of land, the price of lumber, the price of labor. I mean, all of these things, you sort of have there's already kind of a baseline of how much things are going to cost per square foot just based on things that we don't control. So part of what we're trying to understand, is there a way within the code that we can try to reduce that overall development cost? But you're absolutely right. Cash money is going to be part of this, is part of this as well. It's a direct, like you said, sort of gap financing in a way to kind of buy down the cost of that unit for income restricted households or income qualifying households. But, you know, then there are also the price of cost of development includes SDCs and frontage, and there's all these other things that that the code doesn't control, but there has to be another way to get to all of these things. So there will be a matrix of ways to get to this stuff. You're absolutely right. And our housing team, and certainly through the city council with the CET funds and so on, are trying to figure out the right way and the best way to get to these things so we can get some developments that are less than $500,000 a unit. And that's not an easy fix, for sure. I've talked to several different developers and just trying to understand. I mean, it's every little thing matters, you know, every bay window matters. I mean, it's really trying to get to some of these things, but there are so many things that none of us control and can't control, like I said, price of land, for example, or price of lumber and those kinds of things. But you're raising great points, and it's things, and certainly through the affordable housing strategy, and that we're going to be updating as well. That's all the, we have to look at all of these things. I'm glad you're bringing it up. Thank you. And I'm glad Councilor Beatty is hearing it too, so that we can try to figure out how to get to it. I know you've heard it before for sure, but yeah, we're all going to have to work together to try to get to this somehow, to the solution.
Okay.
Jean, did you have
Oh,
comments?
well, I was just thinking, I've heard very little about adjuncts to how people move from their place of residence, whether it's a cottage cluster or a row house, a duplex. But why can't there be incentives for people who don't? I mean, when I was employed years ago, I talked to younger people that I worked with, and they said, I just can't find a place to live that I can afford. And so they would group up, but yet they would spend a lot of money buying really expensive cars because that's what they could afford. So let's say you have an electric scooter, or you like to roller skate or skateboard or a small motorcycle, and you would eliminate the need for parking spaces because those modes of transportation are so compact. And I just don't hear that discussion going on in considering what newer occupants or younger people who move into our area have, and they're familiar with it, and where's that at? Thank you.
That's a good point.
Well, I think that's sort of what Micah was pointing to with the idea of reducing parking requirements. But I also think that the study that our consultant did sort of belies that that's the way people are actually living in Milwaukee. He was finding two cars per unit pretty much everywhere in town. We all talk about that goal. We've been talking about that goal for the last decade that I was on planning commission and then city council, this idea that people are going to give up their cars. Our mayor is a huge advocate for that, but that does not appear to be the reality. And I've actually heard people say that the advent of electric vehicles and the more affordable electric vehicles is actually going to keep more people in cars. And reduce the reduction of single occupancy vehicles. We'll see, I guess. It's all a little bit of a unknown, but I do think we have to take our consultant's study of what we have going on in Milwaukee. We have to take that into account.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other comments, questions right now, you know where to find us if you have any comments or questions as you go through. Sharon, yes.
I know I'm beating a dead horse
No.
on my kind of single pointed focus, but if affordability is really a priority concern, then I think you have to establish that as a priority concern and develop a strategy for implementing it. It's not enough to permit it. It's going to require a lot of time, work, and leadership to develop it.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because we have the affordable housing strategy that was done 5 years ago, I think.
So.
And it's for several years ago, I'll just say it that way. And I know that's, so Laura is, heading up, with our new community development director, we'll be working on sort of the new, affordable housing strategy, and we'll be working on updating that and working on that as well. So you're right. You're absolutely right, Sharon. The code can't do it by itself. And there has to be a focus on figuring out how to make this work. We don't have a ton of resources, but we do have some, and how do we direct it, and how do we get things built here in the city that can do that. You're not beating a dead horse, because I don't think it's dead. I think it's running around, and we need to keep talking about it because it's still, it should be front and center for something for us to think about. And if the code can sort of at least open the doors to these things, how can we get them built? Because up until now, or including now, we have a code that doesn't allow a lot of this stuff or most of this stuff to get built. So allowing it is the first step, but now we have to figure out how to actually get it built.
I just wanted to add in, Sharon, that the House bill, we spend all our time, excuse me, talking about House Bill 2001, but there's a corollary piece to that, which is House Bill 2003, which is trying to get at some of the concerns that you're raising, which is requiring cities to not only change their zoning, but to conduct their housing needs assessment to determine what amount of housing do they need and what types at what income levels, and then to develop a housing production strategy, which is a new requirement. And part of that is cities have been required for a long time to assess their housing needs, but they've never been required to do this other piece, which is to come at exactly defining a strategy for how are they going to meet those housing needs. So it's no longer enough just to say, well, we're growing and we need more housing, but what are you going to do about it? And I would encourage you to look on the DLCD website. There's a lot of strategies that have been identified and that are being passed on to cities as a starting point as they define their housing production strategies. And so there's all of the ideas that people have raised here and more. And so that's a resource to cities as they start to look and build their programs to support the policy aspects.
Okay. Well, this was the part in the meeting where Laura was going to have all kinds of nice things to say about this. So I'm going to try to channel her for a minute. And very, very gratefully, or express my gratitude to all of you for spending so much time with us. It's been a long year. I'm so grateful for all the work and all the time that you've given to us. We would never have put that draft code together without you, of course. And so thank you so much for that. It was a crazy year. I'm sorry, like I said at the beginning, that we weren't having this meeting at an ice cream social or something like that instead. But thank you so much. Again, we're here to talk with you and meet with you at any time to talk about the code. We're going through work sessions this summer with the Planning Commission, and then the hearings will start sometime in the fall, hopefully October, but we'll continue to update you, and you will be in the loop for all of the things as we go, so that you know where we are in the process. You are of course invited and encouraged to participate in those hearings, to provide comments, notes, whatever. We tried to put a code together that reflected mostly everything that we heard. There may be places where we don't go far enough. Maybe we're going too far, what have you. We want this to be as close to what we were all talking about in as we've been going this entire year. So please let us know. As I said, it's not finished, it's not set in stone. This is the time for refinement. So if you're sitting at the beach, it's summertime, I'm sure the code is what you want to be reading. And so if there are things that you notice as you go through, or any little details, please, no details too small, let us know. And if it's not clear, or I thought we said this, does this do that, or anything like that, I'm happy to talk with you about it and make sure the code reflects everything that you've said. So thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And I know I've said it 4 times, I think already, but I'm so sorry that we're doing this last meeting like this. I was really hoping that we were all going to be in the same room, but maybe we'll be able to put something together and we can all kind of get together one last time. But because we all worked really hard, and thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Really do.
Plus, I haven't even met some of you all in person.
That's right. So yeah. Be really great. Oh, and I think one thing, Pauline had mentioned this at one of our meetings, but thanks for letting us see your houses, like the inside of your house. That's been really nice. Thank you for that. That's been great. But yeah,
I just want to echo Sharon's thanks to staff. You all have done a tremendous job of running a very well organized process that ensures that everybody is prepared for these meetings and facilitating a frank discussion, even when I think you've had to field some tough comments and questions. So thank you.
I echo that. Very well said.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. It's been great, actually. This has been it's been a whirlwind, but it's so important. And I've had a great time working on this project, and I continue to do so, but all of us do. It's been a real team effort. So thanks for all of us for putting this together. As we march on to December, hopefully with some draft code or some revised code that we can put something together. Let's see a cottage cluster get built so Sharon can move into one. Sharon, we're going to get you a cottage. Really want to get you a cottage if I can. But thanks very much. If there isn't anything else, any other parting thoughts? Oh yeah, Sharon. Yep, we're gonna get it. We're gonna get it for you if we can. All right. Well, it's a little after 8. Congratulations to Dan. Congratulations to Micah. Got some new committee members coming up. This is great. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that. Congrats to Counselor Beatty for, what is it? Have you come up with a name since this meeting? No, it's not cottage.
Who knows? Maybe that'll stick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
could be shared open space. I don't know. Maybe there's something in there that we can do. But anyway, well, thanks very much, everyone. Please keep in touch if you have any questions. Maybe we'll see you at the farmers market in a couple of weeks. But thanks so much, everyone. Good night. Pauline, you want to stay on for a sec?